Hammy here. In this video we're going to be covering the first section of chapter 18, where we begin to look at how do we take all these different living things in the world around us and start to put them in groups and trying to find some order in this vast diversity we find in our world today. First off, when I say buzzard, what comes to mind? Something like that? You know, something roadkill, and you see these things circling around, and you say, oh, where's the dead meat, right? Well, to us, that's a buzzard, also known as a turkey vulture. If you were to talk to someone from England and you mention the word buzzard, a very different image would come to their mind. Something that we would consider more of a hawk or an eagle would come to their mind. So here's the problem scientists face, is that when we use common names, things that might be a buzzard to us here in Ohio, in Holmes County, might mean completely something different to another scientist in another area of the world. So part of what we're doing with classifying, or why we need to classify, is because we need to get rid of some of that confusion. So scientists, when they use terms or names in their labs and their scientific reports, the scientists know which animals, which organisms they're referring to. Okay, when it comes to assigning scientific names, there's a few rules that we follow. For one, the scientific name for an organism needs to describe that organism, and it also needs to give it a name that is unique just to that organism, just to that species. Okay? Each scientific name must be used by everyone. By everyone, I mean worldwide, because scientists communicate and they read each other's experiments, and so it must only refer to one organism. It can't mean two different kinds of birds like the buzzards. Okay? It must refer to one organism, and everyone is on the same page. Okay? The science of putting names to everything is called taxonomy. And that's going to be our focus this chapter, on taxonomy. How do we classify? What is classification based on? And what is the current system that we are using? The system that we're using now to name organisms, to give them that one specific name, is called binomial nomenclature. So if you break down the word a little bit, the prefix bi, we've talked about in class before. Bi means two, like a bicycle, two wheels. Nome, okay, comes from Latin, which a lot of you have learned in Spanish class. Que es su nombre. Okay, that's your name. So to name, nomenclature. So a name system. So it's a two-name naming system. Exactly what this says. That gives each species a separate name, specific name. Two words must be written in italics. Now if you handwrite it, like on a handwritten report, then we underline it, because it's kind of hard to do italics unless you've got a really shaky hand or something if you're handwriting it. The first word that is the genus name is always capitalized, and then the second word, which is the species name, then is usually lowercase. It's the scientific name we give the organism is often a description of that animal or its habitat of where it might live. Okay, so just some examples. Homo sapiens, that's us. So Homo is the genus name. Sapiens is the species name. Notice, it's in italics. We capitalize the genus name, lowercase for the species name. For a lion, Leo, we often know as lion, so that's a descriptive word that tells us that we're talking about lions. So in the panther genus, Panthera, Leo, the Acer rubrum is a maple tree, and Acer is referring to the maple, rubrum is referring to the fact that it gives it, well, you say, well, that tree is green right now. Well, in the fall, it gets bright red leaves. Okay, Musca domestica. Okay, domestic because we find it in our houses. It's a musca fly that we find in our houses. So oftentimes, the scientific name will tell us a little bit about that species. Why classify? Why do we need that specific name? Why do we need a description? Well, it's like if your mom sent you into the grocery store into, let's say, Food Lion, Kroger, Bueller's, and they said, I need a gallon of 2% milk. Okay. If you walked into the grocery store, okay, you walk in here, and everything would be scattered everywhere around the store, and you'd have to search the aisles up and down, and there would be no order to it. It would be really difficult to find. Now we know that if we're going to find a gallon of 2% milk, we're going to head where? The dairy section. In the dairy section, we'll find the milks. Okay, you have your whole milk, your skim milk, your 2% milk. Okay, we'll find exactly the milk we need, and we can oftentimes, we might have to search for that section, but once we find it, we can narrow it down pretty quickly. Okay, that's the goal in systemics. Systemics in science is trying to take all the organisms we know about in the world and classify them, put them, organize them into groups. Okay, those groups we'll call taxa, which is plural, many taxa, or an organism is placed into a taxon. How bad. I'm out of practice with my pen here, as you can see. Okay, so the goal is to organize everything together. Some of the early classification systems, one of the first ones was Aristotle, way back ancient Greece, sitting around with their togas, thinking about the world around them. Aristotle took the animals and divided them into, okay, the animals that live on land, the animals that live in the ocean, and the animals that are flying around in the air. One of his students, Theophrastus, classified the plants into those grasses and flowers and those kind of things. That would be the herbs. And then kind of the taller, medium-sized plants that had woody stems, he called shrubs. And then the really tall trees, or really tall plants, he called trees. He had herbs, shrubs, and trees. Plants, herbs, shrubs, and trees. Okay? John Ray, which is a little bit later, now we're talking 1700s, said, well, we need to use a language that everybody around the world uses. So he decided to use Latin. The problem was his Latin names, like for an oak tree, and it's not this specific example, but in describing the leaves for the oak tree, the Latin name, I'm not going to say it in Latin because I'm not that proficient in Latin, but translated from Latin, it was oak with deeply divided leaves that have no hairs on their undersides and no teeth around their edges. Okay, now can you imagine writing that in every lab report?
No! No!
Very cumbersome, too cumbersome to work with. So we needed something that was a little bit more precise and a little bit trimmer. Luckily, along came Carolus Linnaeus in the 1700s. Carolus Linnaeus, this is him pictured here, developed a hierarchy, okay, a system of expanding levels. Okay, so we start with the most broad category down here at kingdom. A kingdom includes a whole lot of things, like all the animals, or all the plants, or all the fungi. Okay. Within that, he grouped them into smaller groupings called phyla, or phylum, singular, and then a class, order, family, genus, species. So the kingdoms had the most organisms, and then as you move down, it got more and more and more and more specific until we just learned about the genus and species name was that specific organism. Okay. Now, a good way to remember this, I tell my kids, is to remember King Philip came over for good spaghetti. King Philip came over for good spaghetti. So it might be a good idea to pause the video and write that down in your notes for a good way to remember those 7 levels. Okay? He started originally with around 4 levels, and we've expanded it to 7, and we've actually in the last 20 years have added to that, which I'll get to a little later in the video. There are still some problems with that traditional classification system, because how do you decide which similarities and which differences are most important? Okay, back in the 1800s, what did we use? For example, if we talked about a crab, a barnacle, and a limpet, most of the time, just by looking at them, here's the 3 organisms, okay? So 1, 2, 3. If you had to classify them just based on looking at them, their physical characteristics, we say, oh, well, the barnacle is kind of this flat shell type creature, so is the limpet. So those are probably more closely related. They share a closer common ancestor than the crab that's got these big claws and appendages and is running around on the beach in the bottom of the ocean. So that shared a more distant relative common ancestor than the barnacle and limpets. Okay, this was based on visible similarities. But now, when we look at how they related to each other, and we'll get into this later in the chapter, when you start doing DNA analysis and start looking at some of their proteins and some other characteristics that they didn't look at back then, might come up with this type of classification scheme, where the barnacle and the crab actually share more characteristics than just the shell or outer skeleton than the limpet, which means the crab and the barnacle, okay, both molt their external skeletons, where the limpet just keeps building a bigger and bigger shell. Okay, all of them have tiny free-swimming larvae, but then you start to get into segmentation and molting their external shell. So that's a big difference that would actually tell us that the crab and the barnacle are more closely related than the limpet. Okay, this is the end of section 1.